Hello and welcome to Behind the News here on Win TV Weekend News. I'm your host, Naylan Dwarika, and one of the big stories this week has been the Trinidadian connection in a so-called New York terror plot. Now, it was only 1 year ago that Trinidad shot into international headlines when the Soca Warriors made their debut on the international stage. 12 months later, it's a different sort of warrior making headlines now, and it's all in connection with the global war on terror. And today on set, I'd like to welcome Professor Daniel Gibran.
Thank you, Naylan.
Of the Tennessee State University. He's an expert on terrorism and political Islam. I know you've made some sacrifice to come down here today.
Certainly, yes.
Because you're not in Trinidad very long. So tell me, as your field is terrorism, what is terrorism? What defines it?
Terrorism is a very difficult term to define. There has been a number of attempts. One of the most recent studies was by Alex Schmidt and Youngman. They looked at over 300 definitions of terrorism, and yet they were not able to arrive at some meaningful consensus as to precisely what is terrorism. However, when one is looking at a definition of terrorism, there are a few elements that must be in any definition of terrorism. One, there must be the threat or the actual use of force or violence. It must be for political reasons. There must be a state where the act or the perpetrators of the act want to induce a state of fear on the onlookers. And four, it must be carried out by a group, not an individual. So we make a distinction between terrorism or acts of terrorism and a criminal act. For example, someone going into a bank and holding up a bank and shooting some people. This is a criminal activity. This is a work of a lone gunman. Okay? No. As well as we distinguish terrorism from guerrilla warfare.
Right, which is where I'm going next, because since 9/11, we've had terrorist acts and suspected terrorists being connected, especially to Islam. And the whole dynamic of Islam, because we've known about the sword verses, we've heard the interpretation of scribes like Maududi and Qutb, who have had their own interpretations of the Quran.
Yes.
And we've had that flipped now, where someone with a Muslim name seems to become a prime target for authorities.
That is rather unfortunate, and this seems to be a proclivity of Americans, stereotyping. However, if we look at the fourth wave of terrorism, if one examines the modern history of terrorism, beginning in 1787 with a group in the Soviet Union, or at that time it was Russia, called Narodnaya Volya, which means the people's will. This was an anarchist wave of terrorism. And beginning with that wave, that marked the modern history of terrorism, down to the fourth wave in which we are now, that started around 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This last wave is called the religious wave. And unfortunately, most of the participants in acts of terrorism, or most acts of terrorism that were, that are committed in this fourth wave, have been by religious extremists, mainly Sunni radical Islamists.
Who use the concept of Jahiliyyah.
Yes.
Which is a spiritual darkness, which they deem as spiritual darkness in a country or state.
Yes, Jahiliyyah is a Quranic concept, a very important concept. For most Muslims, Jahiliyyah refers specifically to a time frame in Arab history. That would be pre-Arabian history, before the advent of Muhammad. This was a period of darkness or barbarism. When Muhammad came, he brought enlightenment. So it was Sayyid Qutb and Maududi who reached back to Ibn Taymiyyah, a very revered cleric of the 13th century AD, who in his pronouncements or fatwas against the Mongols at that time, made the statement that Jahiliyyah applies to any society to any people at any time. In other words, it transcends time and space and can be any society can be labeled to be in a state of Jahiliyyah when they depart from Sharia.
So let me try to add something here.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of adding it as a question because I spoke to one of the men who I want to believe the FBI is interested in questioning in this matter. Now, I'm trying to keep on my side of the fence with respect to trial, publicity, and all these things that will come up.
Right.
But I've spoken to this gentleman. He is the leader of the Wajihatul Islamiyah.
Okay.
His name is Umar Mohammed. Abdullah, sorry. Umar Abdullah. And what Mr. Abdullah told me in one conversation is that the premier tenet of any sort of Islam, which is the Islamic oath, Shahada, which roughly in Arabic goes La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, and it declares the singularity of God and just the singularity. He has told me that one interpretation is that there is only God and there is no democracy and there is no communism and there is nothing else outside of that. How do you tie that into these thoughts and ideals of people like Ibn al-Taymiyyah?
Well, not simply radical Islam or political Islam, but Islam generally is opposed to democracy. Democracy is a man-made form of government or an ideology that is, man derivative. Communism, socialism, the same thing. Because these systems of government and of rule are diametrically opposed to the teachings of the Quran. There are individuals who would say, well, what about the concept of the shura? Isn't this a democratic concept? Well, yes and no, in the sense that the shura existed as a consultative body for the caliph.
Right, which would be the head of this caliphate.
Yes, and the caliph will not ask them what to do, but he confers with the shura about his own decisions, but ultimately he makes the decision because the caliph reigns instead or rules in the place of the Prophet Muhammad.
Now, seeing that you have been studying this for so long,
for some time,
and you've done your studies in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Tell me something. What happened last week? What you're speaking now holds a lot of philosophy and history and intent and meaning and interpretation. What happened last week?
Well, let me say this. This terror plot, that came to revelation, is operationally non-executable. One looks at the logistics that should be in place to pull something like this off. And then we look at the perpetrators, or the so-called perpetrators, these four men, who have no knowledge really of explosives, who have no military or a prior military training. They lack the financial as well as human resources to execute a plot of this magnitude. The mere fact that 18 months have passed and these men have not even acquired a pound of explosive material, whether C4, or hand grenades or what have you, leaves one to question the authenticity of the American authorities' claim. In terms of what they have revealed, that this was a bone-chilling plot, and the magnitude was stupendous in terms of the damage that would have been inflicted. One really wonders how feasible a plot like this is.
Well, this is what we've been seeing and reading in the reports now, because
yes, there has been a number of criticisms now as to how feasible it would have been from a technical standpoint when you look at these large containers of jet fuel. Now, let me point out here, jet fuel is not gasoline, which is highly flammable. It's more like kerosene. Okay,
strike a match into it and it will.
Yeah. as well as the tankers that house these millions of gallons of jet fuel, are formidable structures. You throw 5 or 6 grenades near to one of them, and there would hardly be any dents on them, because the structure is so strong, so formidable. And for these men to blow up a number of tankers, that would have caused the kind of damage that it was, that was reported, it would have required large amounts of explosive devices, which these men in 18 months have not been able to acquire, not even an ounce of explosive.
A point I want to bring here, and I just want to bring this whole issue of this terror plot really home.
Yeah.
You've spoken about the response of the U.S. authorities. I remember that happened, around 11 o'clock. The first arrest was on Friday morning.
Right.
So that's more than 24 hours later. The police commissioner, Trevor Paul here, calls a press conference and basically says, in my view, he gives a recap of the international headlines.
Right.
Now, by the time the international networks were already broadcasting these men's names, and one reporter at the press conference asked the commissioner, so can you tell us who these men are? Because obviously as journalists at a press conference, you're not hearing the headlines that are going on live.
Okay.
And the commissioner apparently didn't know, or felt he should see that he couldn't see.
Right.
And the response and some of the feeling from the public now is that, it is not that the police are taking too much credit for this, because so much crime goes unsolved and undetected, and there is this huge happening going on, this huge event, and the police are unjustifiably taking credit when it's really maybe the FBI and the U.S. authorities who are getting these results. And when we are looking, this is what the public is saying,
yes,
that when we are looking for our results, with respect to kidnapping and murders, even robberies and handbag snatching, there is nothing to show for it. How do you think the local authorities have reacted here?
Well, I am not qualified to comment on that for obvious reasons. But let me say this. It was very easy, I think, to ferret out these men. These men were novices. They're not trained professional terrorists. They have no military background. They hardly understand or know military tactics, deception, so on and so forth. So it wasn't difficult, once the exposure, became real, for them to have been rounded up. But I think what is more important was the linkages that the United States authorities were trying to make with these men, and first with Al-Qaeda, and then with the Jamaat Islamiyah, both of which turned out to be rather false. That these terror suspects had no linkages, definitely no linkage with Al-Qaeda. With the Jamaat al-Muslimin, I doubt very much whether there were linkages with the Jamaat. If one look at the Trinidadian gentleman, Ibrahim, who was taken off an aircraft on his way to Venezuela for the express purpose of obtaining a visa from the Iranian embassy to attend a conference in Tehran. From that, I deduce that this gentleman was a Shiite, or is a Shiite Muslim. And hence, the Jamaat would not have anything to do with him. More so, Al-Qaeda.
Now, what you're saying there obviously is going to leave a lot of people with egg on their faces in the morning. So we want to examine some of that, but first we need to take a break. And when we come back, we will talk a little more on that.
Okay.
Welcome back to Behind the News on Win TV Weekend News. We are looking behind the news at the unfolding terror plot. And I use that word very advisedly, considering my guest in studio today, Professor Daniel Gibran. Okay. Daniel, we went to break saying that, that some of the linkages that the U.S. authorities were trying to establish in this huge, internationally televised, live, everything thrown into it bust, seems to have come to naught so far. You have a man who can barely pay his own bail. Right. And, these sorts of elements that you're saying, doesn't constitute a real terror threat, And I remember just a couple of days ago, Paul Azan saying that, Trinidad is a new hotbed for terrorism. And I don't know if people are using a single insurrectionist activity of 17 years ago to say that. But Paula really shouldn't be Azan to say that kind of thing and beat up on Trinidad, because nothing has been proved.
Well, this is precisely what the media has been doing. For the American public, this is very newsworthy. And, it takes some of the heat, some of the steam off the Bush administration in terms of the disastrous war, meaning the global war on terror, as well as what is happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. So here is a very convenient diversion, highlighting or underscoring an event, that took place in 1990.
Which leads to think that in the days after 9/11.
And not realizing the extent to which the Jamaat is a broken organization, both financially and, in terms of membership and resources also. Many of the Jamaat's linkages have been cut, meaning external linkages. The Jamaat is not a strong and formidable organization or movement as it once was. It does not constitute a threat to the extent, that these individuals are trying to make a case of it. Largely because they do not understand what is a threat. Now, what is a threat? A threat must have at least or two major elements. One is the issue of credibility. So when we say a threat is credible, we have to ferret out to what extent the perpetrators of this threat or the planners of this threat have the will to carry it out. Or
that's intention.
Yes, intention. So we could say threat equals I plus C. And the C is very, very important here. C stands for capability. The Jamaat does not have the capability. Much more so, these four men do not have an iota of capability to execute that plot or that threat that, that the United States authorities are claiming. Inasmuch as there were talks, that would signal some kind of intention. But how strong, how formidable was this intention? How real, how credible was this intention in the absence of capabilities?
Which is what I may continue this look at behind this particular news story with, because I want to find out exactly how these conversations and these warrantless wiretaps in the United States, how they are analyzed to give credibility to one and not the other. And just where we had started off talking about the politics and the Bush administration, I remember in the days after 9/11, we had the U.S. Attorney General going on television and every week talking about, we've thwarted this threat and we've prevented this one. Do you think in some small sense that, there is any sort of political gain attached to such an event like this?
Well, let me put it this way. There has been a number of intelligence failures, both on the part of the British and the American on the war on terror, on events in Iraq, so on and so forth. And the failure has been attributed to a failure to dot the I's and cross the T's. Now they have some information And rather than looking at this information objectively, they are reading much more than what is there. The informant of these four men is a suspected he was indicted on charges for drugs. He was an FBI informant, so he was on their payroll also. And by providing information, it would make him look good in terms of reducing his sentence. And
that is one of the things that I want to bring you back here to talk about. Maybe next week, but very soon, at very least. But that brings a cap on this issue of Behind the News.
Thank you.
I'm Naylan Dwarika, and with me, I've had joining me Professor Daniel Gibran. I want to thank you again for being here. Join us next week for Behind the News, and do have a great evening.